The seat in first class. Linda stepped into the airplane with a mixture of excitement and nervousness bubbling in her chest. The moment she saw the shimmering first-class cabin, she had never thought she'd be able to enter, but here she was, standing at the entrance of the most luxurious section of the flight. She adjusted her blouse and checked her boarding pass again, as if she needed reassurance that she truly belonged there. But deep down, she knew that the money she'd saved for months had earned her the right to sit in this place, at least for this one flight. But still, something gnawed at her. She was a single mother, hard-working, and used to sitting in economy, where the space was cramped and the seats felt like they were made for someone half her size. The flight attendant greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Linda nodded back as politely as she could, forcing herself to ignore the uncomfortable feeling in her stomach. She stepped further into the first-class section, feeling the eyes of the passengers follow her every move. It didn't take long before she noticed the difference between them and her: the polished leather seats, the delicate glassware, and the crisp white tablecloths that covered the tables. All of them looked so perfectly put together. And then there was her. She tried not to focus on the feeling that was creeping up inside her, the sense that she didn't belong in this world of high-class passengers and high-end luxury. As she made her way toward her assigned seat, the whispers began to follow her. First a hushed murmur from the man sitting near the window, followed by a low chuckle from the woman next to him. Linda kept her head down and walked faster, but the heat of their gazes was like 1,000 invisible hands tugging at her. She could feel the judgment. She could feel their eyes tracing every step she took, every crease in her clothes, every flaw in her appearance. It felt like they were evaluating her in ways she couldn't escape. But she kept moving. She had come so far to be here, and there was no turning back. Now she reached her seat and sat down quickly, praying the world would leave her alone for just a moment. But the quiet didn't last long. The flight attendant appeared beside her, her eyes scanning Linda's face as if she had to make sure she belonged here. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said in her polite but slightly tense voice. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, an unspoken test. Linda's heart skipped a beat. She could feel her palms growing damp as she struggled to keep her composure. "Yes, my seat is 2A, she said, her voice steady even as a storm of emotions raged inside her. The flight attendant paused for a moment before glancing at her own clipboard. She hesitated just long enough to make Linda feel even more out of place, before nodding curtly. "All right. Please make yourself comfortable." But the words felt hollow, like an invitation to a world she wasn't truly invited into. Linda settled into her seat, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the constant feeling that the entire cabin was watching her every move. She glanced out the window, trying to lose herself in the clouds outside, but that didn't stop the whispers that filled the air around her. She could hear the man across the aisle leaning forward to speak to his travel companion. "They're letting anyone in first class now," he muttered, loud enough for Linda to hear. She could feel her face reddening, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked down at her lap, hoping they couldn't see how badly their words had cut her. But it was no use. Their judgment was everywhere, and it felt like she couldn't escape it. She was just a black woman, a mother trying to give her daughter something better. But in this place, to these people, it didn't matter. She could almost feel her self-esteem slipping away with each passing second as the stares continued to surround her. But she refused to let them see how much their comments hurt her. She had come so far in her life, worked so hard to get to this point, and she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel small. But still, it hurt. The captain's voice suddenly crackled over the intercom, his deep voice warm and reassuring as he announced the flight details. Linda closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of his voice wash over her like a soothing balm, hoping it would calm her nerves. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to take off. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight for a moment." Linda tried to focus on the words, to calm herself, but the unease was still there, gnawing at her from the inside out. The whispers didn't stop. The eyes didn't stop. The unease in her chest didn't stop. She turned to look out the window, but before she could get lost in the view, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the cockpit. Her head snapped toward the front of the plane. Curious, but not expecting anything extraordinary, the cockpit door swung open with a soft whoosh, and the figure that emerged made Linda's breath catch in her throat. It was her daughter. Linda's eyes widened, her mind racing to process what she was seeing. There, in the crisp uniform of a captain, was her daughter, looking every bit the part of the confident, composed officer she had become. The woman who had once sat on Linda's lap as a child, who had once needed her help for everything, now stood before her in the very uniform that commanded respect. Linda's daughter's eyes scanned the cabin for a moment, her gaze locking on Linda's with a surprised yet pleased expression. She smiled and made her way down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythmic beat that seemed to draw the attention of every single passenger. Linda's heart skipped a beat, a rush of emotions flooding her chest. She had always known her daughter was special, always knew she would go far. But to see her now, in charge of this flight, leading these people through the skies, it felt like a dream. The whispers, the judgment, the cold glances, everything that had made Linda feel small, seemed to vanish in that moment, like a fading shadow in the light. Her daughter had arrived, and in a single second, Linda felt like she had been lifted from the depths of doubt. Her daughter was the captain now, and it was her moment to shine. The unexpected turn. Linda's heart raced as she watched her daughter walk toward the cockpit, her figure tall and confident in her uniform. For a moment, she was lost in the pride. She felt the pride she hadn't known she'd been carrying all these years. She had seen her daughter grow up, struggle, and fight through every obstacle that life threw at her. But to see her standing there now, commanding a flight full of passengers, was something Linda could never have imagined. Her daughter, a young woman of 27, had shattered every expectation. It wasn't just that her daughter was a captain, it was the way she held herself, the way she had always held herself, from the moment she could walk. Strong, determined, a force to be reckoned with. Linda could see that same strength in her daughter now as she moved through the cabin, smiling at passengers who greeted her with admiration. She watched as the businessman who had been whispering earlier now straightened in his seat, his eyes widening when he realized who the captain was. The murmurs that had once followed Linda now faded, replaced by a sense of awe that filled the entire cabin. Linda felt her chest tighten with emotion. She wanted to call out to her daughter, to stand up and wave, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Her daughter was now in charge. It was her moment, her time to shine. Linda didn't want to take away from that. She simply sat back in her seat and watched as the young woman she had raised and loved for so long walked into the cockpit, a place that only the most accomplished were allowed to enter. The flight attendant returned to Linda's side, her smile now genuine. "Ma'am, would you like something to drink?" she asked, her voice warmer this time. Linda nodded, still dazed by the turn of events. She took the glass the attendant offered her, but she didn't even taste the drink. Her mind was still replaying the moment when her daughter had entered the cabin. She had always dreamed of moments like this, moments when her daughter would rise above the challenges life had placed before her. But now, seeing it in reality, Linda's heart was full too. Bursting. The atmosphere in first class had shifted completely. The passengers who had once eyed Linda with judgment now watched her daughter with reverence, as though they had just realized that the young woman walking through the cabin wasn't just any woman. She was the one in control. The moment had shifted, the power had changed. As the flight took off and the plane began its ascent into the sky, Linda closed her eyes for a brief second, letting the hum of the engine fill her ears. Her daughter was in control now. She was the captain, and for the first time, Linda felt like she had finally done something right. She had raised a woman who could stand tall in the face of adversity, who had pushed through every barrier society had placed before her, and had come out victorious. But as the minutes passed, Linda couldn't help but remember the comments she had overheard earlier, the way the passengers had looked at her when she had first entered the cabin. They had thought she didn't belong. They had made assumptions based on her appearance, based on the color of her skin, based on the way she carried herself. They had looked down on her, and she had felt every ounce of that judgment. But now, as she sat quietly in her seat, she realized something profound. It wasn't just about what others thought of her, it was about what she had built for herself, what she had built for her daughter. She had created a world where her daughter could fly, could soar to new heights, could defy every expectation and become something extraordinary. The flight was smooth, and as time passed, Linda's pride only grew. She watched as the crew moved about, the cabin, working efficiently, communicating seamlessly with one another. Her daughter was in charge of it all. Soon, the captain's voice echoed over the intercom again, this time with more warmth, more authority, more confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are cruising at 35,000 feet, and we are currently on track for an on-time arrival. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask the crew." Linda's heart swelled as she listened to her daughter's calm, confident voice. She had always believed in her, and had always known that her daughter was destined for greatness. But hearing her daughter speak over the intercom, hearing the respect and admiration in the passengers' voices as they acknowledged the young woman in charge, it was a dream come true. But that was when Linda noticed something strange. She hadn't been paying much attention to the passengers around her, but now she could see a change in their behavior. The businesswoman who had looked at Linda so dismissively earlier was now smiling at her daughter's voice, her eyes wide with admiration. The businessman who had whispered about Linda was now nervously tapping his fingers on the armrest. Glancing from the cockpit to the flight attendant and back again, Linda had expected that her daughter's position as captain would shift the energy of the cabin, but she hadn't anticipated how dramatically it would change. The quiet whispers that had once been aimed at her had now turned to soft murmurs of respect toward her daughter. There was a subtle shift in the air, as though the entire cabin had just woken up to the reality that this young woman, this daughter of Linda's, was in control now. She was the one who had the power, who had the respect, who had earned every bit of it. The flight continued, and as the hours passed, Linda found herself growing more and more at peace. Her daughter was up there, doing what she was born to do, leading the flight with a confidence that had always been there, even when Linda had doubted it. She remembered the years when her daughter had struggled in school, when Linda had fought to make ends meet, when everything seemed like an uphill battle. But now, looking at her daughter as the captain of this plane, Linda knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. It was almost time for the meal service, and the flight attendants were preparing to serve the passengers. Linda watched as the woman who had questioned her earlier now approached with a tray, her smile softening into something more genuine. "Would you like something to eat?" the attendant asked, her voice warmer now. Linda nodded and accepted the meal, but her mind wasn't on the food. She was watching her daughter, who was no longer just her little girl. She was the captain now, and she was shaping the world around her in a way that Linda had always known she could. As Linda ate, she thought back to the way the passengers had treated her when she first entered the cabin, the way they had assumed she didn't belong. But now, it was clear, the power had shifted. They weren't looking down on her anymore, they were looking up to her daughter. The feeling was bittersweet, but Linda couldn't help but smile. She had raised a woman who was not only capable of handling her own, but was now in a position where she commanded respect. Linda had always been proud of her daughter, but in this moment, in this very place, that pride felt like it was finally justified. The flight would continue, and by the time they landed, Linda knew that the world would see her daughter in a new light. The same world that had once questioned her place in first class would now watch in awe as Linda's daughter took her place in the skies, leading with grace and strength. And in that moment, Linda understood the true meaning of victory. It wasn't just about earning a seat in first class. It was about earning the respect and admiration of the world. It was about proving that no matter who you were, no matter where you came from, you could rise to the top and break through every barrier placed in front of you. The power of recognition. As the flight continued its journey high above the clouds, Linda settled into a new sense of peace, a peace that had been absent for far too long. She gazed out the window, watching the vast expanse of the world below her, feeling a sense of awe at how far her daughter had come. She had always known her daughter was destined for greatness, but seeing her in action, commanding a plane with the confidence of someone who had belonged in the cockpit her whole life, was a feeling that went beyond pride. It was a feeling of validation, a feeling of knowing that all the sacrifices Linda had made throughout the years had led to this very moment. It wasn't just about the luxury of being in first class, or the validation that came with the whispers shifting from judgment to admiration. It was the knowledge that her daughter had taken her place in the world, that she had created her own path to success, and that she was now standing in a space that was once reserved for the few who had been given privileges by birth or circumstance. Linda couldn't help but think about all the times she had wondered if she was doing enough. There had been nights when she lay awake, worrying if she was giving her daughter the right tools to navigate the world, if she was preparing her for the challenges that lay ahead. Every time her daughter struggled in school, every time she came home with tears in her eyes after facing harsh judgments, Linda had felt a sense of guilt. Had she failed her? Had she done enough? But now, Looking at the way her daughter commanded the respect of everyone around her, Linda knew that she had done everything right. She had taught her daughter resilience. She had shown her the importance of hard work, and most importantly, she had given her the strength to rise above every obstacle that life had placed in her path. The flight attendants continued to move about the cabin, offering drinks and snacks, but Linda didn't notice them. Her eyes were fixed on the cockpit, on the door that separated her from her daughter's world. Linda could still hear the calm, confident voice of her daughter over the intercom, checking in with the passengers, ensuring everything was running smoothly. She could feel the weight of those words, not as a simple announcement, but as a declaration of authority, as a declaration that her daughter had earned her place. And as Linda sat there, in her seat in first class, she realized something else. This wasn't just her daughter's victory, it was hers too. She had helped shape this success, had given her everything she could to make sure her daughter was prepared for a world that would constantly try to tell her she wasn't enough, that she didn't belong. But now, that world had to look at her daughter differently. They had to acknowledge the fact that this woman, this young captain, had earned everything she had achieved. There was no longer room for doubt, no longer room for judgment. Linda's daughter had proven that no matter the odds, no matter the barriers, she could break through them. Linda smiled to herself, a quiet joy blooming in her chest as she realized that this moment, this flight, this world, had shifted in ways she never expected. When she had first entered the cabin, she had been nothing more than a subject of curiosity, a woman of color in a space where she clearly didn't belong, or so they had thought. But now, with her daughter in the cockpit, Linda was no longer just a woman to be judged. She was the mother of the captain, the woman who had helped raise a leader. She could feel the change in the air, the subtle shift that happened when the passengers realized who her daughter was. The man who had once looked down on her now sat with a newfound respect, his eyes not lingering on her, but on the cockpit door. The woman in pearls, who had been so quick to judge Linda for simply existing in this space, now looked at her with a glimmer of admiration in her eyes. It was as if the entire plane had shifted its perspective, realizing that Linda was no longer just a passenger. She was the mother of a leader. The meal service was completed, and the cabin began to settle into a quiet hum of relaxation. People reclined in their seats, some reading, others watching movies, and Linda found herself in a rare moment of solitude. Her thoughts drifted to the past, to the years of struggle, the late nights spent trying to make ends meet, the long hours at work, the moments of doubt. She had always done her best, but she had never imagined this. She had never imagined that her daughter would rise so high, so quickly, to claim the respect that was so often denied to women like them. Linda had been aware of the challenges her daughter would face in life. She had been aware of the struggles that would come simply because of the color of her skin, the way people would see her and would judge her before they even got to know her. She had always feared that the world would try to break her daughter, to make her feel small, but at this moment, Linda knew that her daughter had already proven herself. Her daughter had done the unthinkable. She had not only broken through the barriers that had been set for her, but had built a new path for others to follow. She had risen above the expectations, above the stereotypes, above the limitations that society had tried to place on her, and, in doing so, she had paved the way for others to come after her. Linda leaned back in her seat, her hand resting on the armrest as she looked around the cabin. The quiet hum of the flight was the only sound now, but Linda felt like the whole world was changing around her. The passengers who had once looked at her with disdain now saw her in a different light. They saw her not just as a woman, not just as a mother, but as the source of a legacy that had led to this moment, this flight, this victory. And for the first time, Linda realized that the world would never look at her the same way again. Her daughter had earned that respect, had earned that authority, and now, it was time for Linda to stand tall, to walk with her head held high. She had played her part, and now it was time for her to embrace the new world that her daughter had created for both of them. As the flight continued, Linda felt a deep sense of satisfaction, a satisfaction that came from knowing that her daughter had done the impossible. She had risen above every challenge, every obstacle, and had become the very thing that society had told her she couldn't be. She had become a captain. The moment The world seized. The steady hum of the engines filled the air as the plane glided smoothly above the clouds, and Linda sat in her seat, still taking in the weight of what she had just witnessed. For years, she had imagined what success for her daughter might look like, but she had never imagined it like this, never imagined it so grand, so undeniable, so commanding. Her daughter in that crisp captain's uniform was not just a pilot, she was a symbol of everything Linda had fought for. Every long night, every sacrifice, every tear that had fallen without anyone there to see it had built the woman now sitting at the controls of this plane, guiding hundreds of passengers through the sky. Linda shifted in her seat, feeling the eyes on her not with the same sharpness that had cut her when she first boarded, but with something softer, something more curious. The businessman who had smirked earlier now seemed restless, his gaze flickering to her from time to time, as if trying to reconcile the image he had of her before with the reality he was now forced to accept. The woman in pearls sat straighter, her chin no longer tilted in quiet superiority, but lowered just slightly, in a way that almost felt like humility. The flight attendant returned this time with a warmer smile and asked if Linda was enjoying the flight. The tone was friendly, even respectful, and Linda simply nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction settled into her bones. She had no need to gloat, no need to say a word. Her daughter's presence had spoken louder than anything she could have said in her own defense. Time seemed to stretch as the clouds passed lazily beneath them, and the sun bathed the cabin in a golden glow. It felt like a moment suspended in air. Not just because they were thousands of feet above the ground, but because Linda knew that the truth of who her daughter was had cut through every assumption, every whisper, every unspoken bias in the vet room, and she could feel the ripple of that truth in the way the cabin had shifted from judgment to respect. The soft chime of the intercom interrupted her thoughts, and the familiar voice filled the space once again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to thank you all for choosing to fly with us today. We are making excellent time, and I am pleased to let you know that we are expecting clear skies all the way to our destination. It was just a routine update, but to Linda it was more than that. Her daughter's voice carried the weight of authority, the warmth of reassurance, and the unshakable confidence of someone who had fought to be where she was. Her daughter had not been handed this role. She had earned it through relentless effort, through late nights of studying, through the grueling tests and the endless hours of training. The passengers around Linda seemed to hear it too. The businessman leaned back as if reconsidering his earlier thoughts. The woman in pearls allowed herself a faint smile, perhaps even a silent admission that her first impression had been wrong. The moment the intercom clicked off, Linda felt a swell of emotions and memories began to flood her mind. She remembered the day her daughter came home from school, announcing she wanted to be a pilot. She remembered the cautious way she had smiled, hiding her own fear of how impossible that dream might be for a young black girl. She remembered the rejections, the setbacks, the times her daughter had almost given up, and how each time Linda had been there to push her forward, to remind her of her worth, to remind her that no dream was too far if she was willing to fight for it. Shy thought of the times when her daughter's friends had chosen safer paths, when people had laughed at her ambition, when even relatives had suggested she lower her expectations and choose something easier, but her daughter had refused. She had stood firm in her belief that she belonged in the skies, and Linda had stood beside her every step of the way. Now here she was, the captain of this flight, commanding the respect of every passenger on board, including the very ones who had looked at Linda like she didn't belong only hours ago. Linda's gaze drifted toward the cockpit door, and she wondered if her daughter knew what had happened before she arrived, if she knew about the whispers, the stares, the questioning of her presence. Perhaps she didn't, and maybe that was for the best. Linda didn't want to burden her daughter with the ugliness of that moment, not when she was carrying the weight of so many lives and the honor of her own accomplishment. But deep down Linda knew that even if her daughter had been aware, she would not have let it break her. She was too strong, too focused on the task at hand. The hours ticked by, and the cabin grew quieter as passengers settled into their routines. Some slept, others read books or watched movies, but Linda sat in quiet reflection, watching the sunlight paint the clouds outside in shades of gold and pink. It was as though the heavens themselves were celebrating with her, each streak of light a reminder that no matter how dark the world could be, there would always be moments of brilliance. Moments like this. A soft announcement came through once more, letting the passengers know they would be descending soon, and Linda felt a twinge of bittersweet. emotion. She didn't want the flight to end. She didn't want this bubble of pride and peace to burst, but she also knew that landing would mark another moment, a moment when her daughter would step out of the cockpit in full view of everyone, and the truth of who she was would be impossible to ignore. Linda's heart began to race in anticipation as she imagined that scene. The passengers who had once doubted her would see her daughter up close. The businessman would realize that the mother he had silently belittled had raised the leader of this flight. The woman in pearls would have to reconcile her quiet disapproval with the reality of who had been guiding her safely across the sky. It would be a silent but powerful reckoning, and Linda knew she would not have to say a single word for the message to be understood. She adjusted her seatbelt as the plane began its gradual descent, the hum of the engines changing pitch, the clouds giving way to a sprawling view of the city below, buildings glinting in the afternoon sunstreets, winding like ribbons. The view was breathtaking, but Linda's attention was on what was to come. Her daughter would soon walk through that cabin again, and the sight of her would be the final word in a conversation that had started the moment. Linda had stepped into first class. The wheels touched down with a gentle thud, and the passengers around her began gathering their belongings. The cabin filled with the soft rustle of movement, but Linda sat still, her eyes fixed on the cockpit door when it finally opened and her daughter emerged. Every head turned, her uniform immaculate, her posture perfect, her expression calm yet commanding. She walked down the aisle, greeting passengers with a professional smile, but when her eyes met Linda's, there was a flicker of warmth, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them. In that brief moment, the entire journey of their lives seemed to be contained in a single glance, the hardships, the sacrifices, the victories, all culminating in this. The businessman nodded respectfully as she passed. The woman in pearls offered a polite smile, and Linda felt an almost electric satisfaction. This was not just about proving them wrong, it was about proving her daughter right, proving that she belonged, proving that she had earned every step of her journey. And as her daughter disappeared toward the exit, Linda finally stood, gathering her own bag, her steps steady, her head held high. The world might not have been ready for this moment when they boarded, but now, after everything they had seen, there was no denying it. Her daughter was the captain, and Linda was the woman who had raised her. The conversation that changed everything, that slow shuffle of passengers moving toward the exit, felt almost surreal to Linda as she stood in the aisle, her bag clutched loosely in her hand. The world around her seemed muted, as if the sounds of zippers snapping and overhead bins closing were happening in another place entirely. She could still see her daughter's face in her mind, the calm confidence in her eyes, the quiet pride hidden beneath her professional smile, and that single warm glance. They had shared a glance that told the story of their lives, without a single word being spoken. As the line moved forward, Linda found herself behind the businessman who had made the earlier comment. He glanced back at her only briefly, and his eyes seemed different now, softer, perhaps even apologetic. Though he said nothing, the silence between them spoke volumes. It was a silence heavy with realization, and maybe even a little shame, and Linda let it be. She had no interest in rubbing salt into an old wound. The moment had already been one. The woman in pearls was further ahead, chatting lightly with another passenger, her voice now tinged with the friendliness that had been absent before. Linda wondered if the woman even recognized her own shift in tone, from cold dismissal to quiet respect. It did not matter either way. What mattered was that the cabin of that plane had witnessed something undeniable, a shift in perception, a confrontation of assumption, and all of it had happened without Linda ever needing to raise her voice. When she stepped off the plane, the warm air of the terminal washed over her, and there, waiting just past the gate, stood her daughter, still in uniform, her cap tucked under her arm, her dark hair neatly pulled back, the lines of her jacket sharp and perfect. She was greeting passengers as they stepped out, shaking hands with a few, smiling for photos with others. But when her eyes found Linda, her professional demeanor softened instantly. Met halfway between the gate and the seating area, and for the moment they simply stood there facing each other, the noise of the terminal fading into the background. Linda could feel the sting of tears in her eyes, but she held them back. She didn't want to cry. She wanted to remember this moment with clarity. She wanted to see her daughter exactly as she was, strong, poised, accomplished. "Ma'am, I didn't expect to see you here," her daughter said, with a smile, though her voice carried a touch of surprise. "I thought you were working this week." Linda returned that smile. "I wanted to surprise you, and I think I did," she replied, and her voice was warm with pride. "You did." Her daughter laughed, then her expression shifted as she studied her mother's face for a moment. "Are you all right? Did something happen on the flight?" Linda hesitated. The temptation to tell her everything about the whispers, the stares, the questions hung in the air. But she let it pass. Instead, she stepped closer, reaching out to straighten the collar of her daughter's uniform, a small gesture that reminded her of when her daughter was little, before every school day, before every important moment in her life. "No, nothing happened," Linda said softly. "Everything was perfect." Her daughter seemed to understand that there was more beneath the words, but she didn't press. Instead, she took her mother's hand and led her toward the quiet seating area by the large glass windows. Planes rolled across the tarmac, outside engines roaring in the distance, the afternoon sun casting a soft golden hue. Across the floor they sat together, and for a while they simply talked about the flight, about her daughter's schedule, about how often she was flying now. Linda listened intently to every word, soaking in the sound of her voice. She was amazed at how far her daughter had come, and yet, in some ways, she was still the same determined young woman who had told her years ago that she would not settle for anything less than the captain's set. Eventually, her daughter's voice grew quieter, and she looked at her mother with a more serious expression. "Mom, do you remember when I told you I wanted to be a pilot, and you didn't laugh at me?" Linda chuckled. "I remember I wanted to, but I didn't, because I could see how serious you were." Her daughter smiled faintly. "I've thought about that moment a lot. Over the years, you were the only one who didn't tell me to pick something else. You told me it would be hard, but that I could do it if I worked for it. That stuck with me more than you know." Linda felt her chest tighten, the weight of years of sacrifices pressing in on her, but in that moment the burden didn't feel heavy. It felt worth it. Every single late night, every single extra shift, every single choice she had made to put her daughter first had led to this. "You've done more than I ever dreamed," Linda said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've shown them all what's possible." Her daughter reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "They didn't make it easy for me, Mom, you know that, but every time I thought about quitting, I thought about you. I thought about how you never let anyone tell you who you could be or where you belonged." The words sank deep into Linda's heart, and she realized that the journey they had both been on was not just about breaking barriers. It was about refusing to let the world decide their worth. They had faced the same doubts, the same prejudices, but they had done it together. Where boarding call echoed through the terminal, breaking the moment. But neither of them moved right away. Linda simply sat there holding her daughter's hand, feeling the quiet victory that was theirs alone. When they finally stood, her daughter placed her captain's cap back on her head and gave her a small nod. "I have another flight soon, but I'll walk you to the exit." They moved through the terminal side by side, and though no one else knew their story, every step they took together felt like a declaration that they belonged everywhere they chose to be. The eyes that followed them now were not filled with doubt, but with curiosity and even admiration. At the curb, her daughter hugged her tightly and whispered, "Thank you, Mom, for never letting me give up." Linda held her close, her own voice steady as she replied, "I didn't let you give up because I knew this was where you were meant to be, up there in the sky, showing them all what you can do." Her daughter pulled back, gave one last smile, and turned toward the terminal, disappearing into the crowd. And Linda watched her go, feeling lighter than she had in years. She knew the challenges in the world were far from over, but for now this victory was enough. This moment was theirs, and no one could take it away. She turned to leave, her step steady, her head high, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't just feel like she belonged, she knew it. The legacy in the sky. Linda walked slowly toward the taxi stand outside the terminal, the warm air brushing against her face as the hum of the airport surrounded her. Yet her mind was still back on that plane, still in that first-class cabin, still in that moment. When the world had shifted without anyone announcing it, she could feel the difference in herself. She could feel the way her shoulders stayed straighter, the way her steps held a rhythm that spoke of quiet power. Her daughter had walked into that cabin and changed everything, and now Linda carried that change with her. The line for taxis was short, and she found herself at the front. Quickly the driver stepped out to help with her bag, and for the first time in a long time Linda accepted the gesture. Without a flicker of self-consciousness, she slid into the seat and watched as the terminal slid away behind her, the tall glass windows reflecting the golden light of late afternoon. She thought about the look in her daughter's eyes when they had spoken in the seating area. It was a look that said she understood the journey they had taken together, a look that said every sacrifice had been worth it. As the car moved through the city streets, Linda thought of all the moments that had brought them here. She thought of the nights when she had come home from work so exhausted she could barely stand, but still found the energy to check her daughter's homework. She thought of the mornings when they had eaten breakfast together in silence, both too tired to speak but still comforted by each other's presence. She thought of the days when her daughter had faced rejection and come home ready to give up, only to be met with a steady voice telling her to try again, because their story was not going to end in surrender. Taxi driver asked where she was headed, and she gave the address of her modest home in a quiet neighborhood. As they drove, she watched people on the sidewalks carrying their own burdens and dreams. She realized that each of them had their own battles invisible to everyone else, just as she and her daughter had theirs, and she wondered how many of them would ever see the kind of victory she had witnessed today. When they arrived home, Linda stepped out onto the pavement and looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant canvas of orange and pink, the colors blending into one another like the chapters of a story she knew. The plane her daughter had just boarded was already climbing back into that sky, carrying hundreds of people who might never know the full story of the woman guiding them, but they would feel the calm, steady assurance in her voice, and that would be enough inside her home. The silence wrapped around her like a blanket, but it was not the lonely silence she had known before. This was a peaceful silence, filled with the echo of her daughter's laughter and the memory of her steady gaze. She set her bag down and walked to the small table by the window where a framed photograph stood. It was from years ago, her daughter wearing a toy pilot's cap, grinning widely with missing front teeth. Linda picked it up, her fingers tracing the edges of the frame. She thought about the way her daughter had walked through that cabin today, commanding respect without a single word of defense. She thought about the way passengers who had once doubted her had been forced to confront the truth, and she realized something important. This victory was not just for them, it was for everyone who had been told they did not belong, everyone who had been made to feel small in spaces where they had earned the right to stand tall. The phone rang, breaking the quiet, and Linda reached for it. It was her daughter calling from the cockpit before the next flight was underway. Her voice was bright and full of life. "I just wanted to hear your voice before we take off again," she said, and Linda smiled, hearing the faint background hum of the engines. "I'm home now," Linda replied, "and I'm so proud of you." There was a pause on the other end, and then her daughter spoke in a tone that was softer, almost reverent. "I'm proud of you too, Mom. I'm here because of you." When the call ended, Linda set the phone down and looked out the window. The sky was darkening now, the first stars beginning to appear. She imagined her daughter's plane slicing through that darkness, guided by the same determination that had brought her here. She sat for a long time, just watching the night settle over the world, knowing that tomorrow her daughter would be somewhere else, in another sky, in another city, proving once again that she belonged wherever she chose to be. And Linda too would carry that truth with her into every room, every street, every space she entered. Her daughter was the captain, but in her heart, Linda knew she had been the one to chart the course long before the first flight plan was ever filed, and that was a legacy no one could take away.